The idea of the Arctic had always seemed more myth than reality. I pictured it as a flat white canvas where only the brave or foolish ventured, a land where the wind scraped skin and the sun rarely warmed the ground. But myths, as I had come to learn, had a habit of being far less romantic up close. I found myself staring out the oval window of a turboprop plane slicing its way through low-hanging clouds. Below stretched an expanse of jagged sea ice, fractured into irregular puzzle pieces floating on an ink-black sea. The plane vibrated against the wind currents, a constant, rhythmic hum that I had come to accept as both reassuring and unnerving. I was headed north as part of a climate monitoring initiative. My role was simple: catalog soil temperatures, measure ice layer thickness, and record data on permafrost stability. The team back at the university wanted real numbers from boots on the ground, not satellite estimates. I had volunteered for reasons even I barely understood. Perhaps it was the thrill of untouched places. Perhaps it was the gnawing feeling that I needed to see for myself how quickly the world was changing. We landed on a strip of compressed snow near a weather station on Banks Island in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. The wheels crunched onto the makeshift runway, the kind that vanished by late spring when the melt began. I stepped out into air so cold it burned the lining of my nose. My breath hung in front of me, slow to fade in the stillness. The temperature hung near -20 degrees Celsius, but with the wind rolling in from the Beaufort Sea, it felt colder. The ground beneath my boots was a hard, grayish crust of compacted snow over permafrost. It gave slightly a reminder that even the most permanent things were susceptible to change. The horizon seemed limitless. A white desert broken only by the skeletal forms of dwarf willows crouched low against the earth. They looked more like tangled roots than trees, stunted by centuries of adaptation. The sky was a blank slate of pale gray, casting an even, eerie light over everything. It was neither dawn nor dusk, but something in between. The sun hovered at a shallow angle, too weak to offer warmth. In this latitude, daylight was a loose concept. The polar sun dragged itself around the edge of the sky, reluctant to rise, hesitant to set. The Arctic air carried a sharpness I had never known before. It was not the dry cold of high mountains or the damp chill of winter forests. This was a living thing, a wind that sliced with surgical precision, carrying the scent of ice, salt, and ancient earth. Every exposed inch of skin reacted instantly, tightening, resisting. I unpacked my gear from the sled the station manager had left for me. A snowmobile, rigged with ground sensors, sat idling nearby. My tent, lined with synthetic insulation, seemed pitifully thin against the open expanse. But there was no going back. The nearest settlement was 100 kilometers south, a speck of human persistence against a backdrop of frozen time. As I set my first marker, a steel rod meant to measure permafrost depth, I drove it into the ground with a weighted hammer. It resisted at first, then slipped smoothly into the softened upper layer. The active layer, as it was called, melted every summer and froze again by autumn. But recent data showed it was melting deeper with each passing year. The ground felt almost alive beneath my feet, as if it remembered warmth and resented its return. I moved methodically, setting up ground temperature sensors at intervals mapped by satellite imagery. The wind tugged at the hem of my coat as I worked, pulling at my resolve with invisible fingers. There was no sound except the faint, rhythmic hum of the wind, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the snow crust. In the distance, the land curved into a soft rise where the tundra gave way to ice-washed cliffs. Beyond that, the Arctic Ocean stretched toward the pole, a frozen expanse etched with pressure ridges and leads. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the endless white. The stillness here felt sacred, almost fragile. I wondered how long it would last. As I worked, I became aware of something else, a faint vibration beneath my boots. Not seismic, not a storm. A deep, slow hum carried through the frozen ground, the living heartbeat of a world few would ever walk upon. I marked my last data point for the day as the low sun brushed the horizon, staining the sky in faint pastels. My hands ached from the cold, even beneath thermal gloves. I turned back toward the outpost, my sled trailing behind me. I felt small in a way I had never experienced before. Not insignificant, not afraid, just small. And in this land of ancient ice, that felt exactly right. The second morning arrived long before the sun did. I woke to the soft crackle of the tent walls shifting under a slow, persistent wind. The stove hummed faintly beside me, casting a dim glow that barely pushed against the darkness. I forced myself from the warmth of my sleeping bag, layering thick wool and synthetic blends with a methodical rhythm. My breath hung in the air, suspended like mist before vanishing into the thin Arctic atmosphere. Outside, the wind moved in steady waves, dragging thin veils of snow across the barren ground. The horizon remained a seamless smear of white and gray. The land gave no clues where it ended and where the sky began. There was no birdsong, no rustling trees, no distant hum of human life. Only the Arctic silence, a silence so profound it felt alive, pressing against my ears with a slow, heavy weight. I packed light for the day's trek. The essentials were secured in the sled behind me. Today's route would carry me deeper into the tundra, across terrain marked by shallow hummocks and thin snowpack hardened by wind. The sled runners glided with a whisper over the crusted surface. I moved steadily, my breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. The Arctic ground bore strange patterns, born from the freeze-thaw cycles of permafrost. Ice beneath the surface shaped the land into ridges, circles, and irregular polygons. These geometric patterns, known as patterned ground, stretched for meters in all directions. They resembled scars etched by some ancient, methodical hand. I walked among them, feeling the crunch of snow over frozen soil underfoot. A few kilometers into the trek, I paused at a shallow depression where the wind had scoured the snow thin. Beneath the surface, the frozen earth cracked in jagged lines, exposing wedges of ice thrust between layers of soil. These ice wedges were relics of a cycle repeated over centuries. Water seeped into cracks, froze, and expanded, slowly forcing the earth apart. I crouched, brushing snow aside, tracing my gloved fingers over the crystalline structures. I took photographs for the records, the cold biting into my hands despite thermal gloves. The permafrost beneath me acted as a vault, locking away millennia of Earth's biological history. Within it rested the remains of extinct plants, ancient animals, and long-dormant microbes. A living time capsule, one that thawed more with each warming season. Every meter I walked over was layered with stories older than human memory. I moved on, setting permafrost temperature probes at mapped intervals. The readings varied. Some areas remained stable near -10 degrees Celsius. Others flirted with warmer thresholds, dipping perilously close to zero. It was a silent confirmation of what climate models hinted at. The once reliable permafrost was shifting beneath our feet, growing more fragile with every passing year. By midday, the wind settled. I climbed a low ridge that offered a wide view of the frozen plains. The tundra stretched out in all directions, a frozen sea of snow-blanketed earth, broken only by the faint shimmer of a meandering stream locked in ice. In the distance, I spotted a herd of muskox grazing, their dark, hulking forms etched against the whiteness. They moved with slow certainty, heads bowed to the snow. Muskoxen were relics of the Ice Age, survivors sculpted by this brutal environment. Their thick coats trapped precious body heat, a double layer of dense underwool and shaggy guard hairs. Watching them was like glimpsing another era, one where creatures adapted to the harshness without complaint, without pause. I stood on the ridge longer than I intended, the cold seeping slowly into my layers. It was easy to forget the passage of time here. The land felt caught in a suspended moment, waiting for something that never came. I pulled my scarf tighter and descended, angling toward a frozen stream bed. The stream had carved a shallow trench through the permafrost, its banks laced with hoarfrost that glittered faintly in the muted light. Ice clung to the exposed roots of low-lying willows, the only plants daring enough to exist here. I tested the ice with a pole before stepping carefully onto its surface. It held firm, the crackling echo of my steps swallowed by the vast emptiness around me. By late afternoon, a mist began to rise in thin ribbons from the ground. It curled lazily around low mounds and across the ice, a natural reaction to the slight warming of the air against the frigid surface. The effect was eerie, ghost-like veils drifting aimlessly across a silent, sleeping land. It felt as if the tundra itself was exhaling, releasing the breath it had held for centuries. I set camp near a ridge of wind-packed snow, anchoring the tent securely with ice screws and snow anchors. I buried the sled partially in a drift to keep it from shifting in the night. As I worked, I noticed how the low twilight refracted off ice crystals in the air, painting faint, iridescent arcs across the horizon. Darkness settled slowly, smothering the land in its quiet embrace. I boiled water over the stove, the sound hissing softly in the stillness. I ate without hurry, sitting cross-legged outside the tent, watching the horizon bleed into a deeper shade of indigo. The aurora teased the sky, thin streaks of green that pulsed and faded in a silent rhythm. I remained until the cold began gnawing at the tips of my fingers. The Arctic gave nothing away easily, not even its beauty. I crawled into the tent, sealing the flaps against the creeping chill. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind hum gently against the canvas. Out here, time was a patient thing. It stretched thin, unraveling with each silent breath of wind, until the hours melted into one another. I closed my eyes, letting the pulse of this frozen land beat against my senses. Tomorrow, I would go farther. I woke beneath a pale sky washed in icy shades of blue and gray. The wind had calmed, the landscape stretched in silent stillness beyond the thin walls of my tent. I emerged into a morning cloaked in frost and faint light, the air so crisp it felt like stepping into glass. The stove crackled faintly in the shelter as I packed up camp, securing the sled and tightening the straps on my gear. Today, I plan to push farther north, away from the faint comfort of the outpost's perimeter. The ground beneath my boots crunched with every step. The ice-sheathed tundra gave way only slightly under my weight. I moved with measured caution, scanning the ground for thin ice or hidden crevasses. The sled tracked obediently behind, its runners gliding over the frozen crust. The first few kilometers passed in a blur of soft snowfields and low-lying frost hummocks. The patterns underfoot were more intricate here, perfect geometric shapes created by nature's slow, meticulous hand. As midday approached, I noticed subtle changes in the terrain. The snow thinned, revealing patches of frost-bitten earth and patches of ice-polished stone. The wind-carved ridges grew sharper, etched with crystalline patterns that sparkled faintly beneath the subdued sun. I climbed a gentle slope, my breath steaming in the freezing air, and crested the rise to a view that halted me in my tracks. Before me stretched an endless sea of frost heaves and ice ridges, a labyrinth of frozen waves frozen mid-crest. They extended as far as the eye could see, rolling in silent, jagged rows across the barren land. I descended carefully into the frozen maze, the sled sliding behind with a soft hiss. Navigating through the frost ridges demanded attention. The ice formed sharp crests, some standing waist-high, their edges brittle but dangerous. I traced a path between the heaves, weaving through the frozen labyrinth. The wind had carved shallow troughs into the snow, revealing bands of dark soil and glittering ice. I paused to take readings, pressing the temperature probe into the exposed ground. The sensor beeped softly, displaying a temperature hovering dangerously close to thaw. I made notes in my journal, the ink freezing if I paused too long between entries. The data confirmed what climate models predicted. The active layer was deepening, permafrost losing its grip on the land. A faint vibration beneath my boots caught my attention. It felt like a low hum, subtle yet persistent. The wind stirred the snow in soft flurries, a quiet reminder of the land's restless nature. Hours passed as I navigated the frozen expanse. My legs burned with effort, the sled pulling at my shoulders. I climbed another rise as twilight approached, the sky shifting to soft hues of pink and pale lavender. The aurora shimmered faintly at the edge of vision, a spectral presence on the horizon. I pitched camp on a narrow ridge overlooking a frozen basin. The tent stood firm against the light wind, the sled anchored securely beside it. As night fell, I sat outside, watching the sky shift and dance. The Arctic's beauty remained indifferent to my presence, vast and silent. I boiled water, my hands steady despite the cold. The wind whispered through the ice ridges below, a soft, patient song echoing across the empty land. Tomorrow I would venture farther. Morning broke with a light that seemed drained of color, a thin, spectral glow cast through a veil of low-lying cloud. I stirred within the cocoon of my sleeping bag, breath misting in slow curls above me. Every joint protested as I stretched, shoulders stiff, legs sore from the constant drag of the sled. The cold had pressed against the thin walls of the tent all night, a silent, persistent force gnawing at the edges of warmth. I forced myself upright, lit the stove, and waited as its soft hiss grew into a faint crackle. The water boiled sluggishly, steam curling into the frigid air. Outside, the wind had stilled again, a deceptive calm I was learning to distrust. I broke camp quickly, moving with the practiced efficiency of habit. By the time the last strap tightened over the sled, the faint sun was a pale smear on the low horizon. I pressed northward into the ice fields. The landscape shifted as the morning dragged on. The frost ridges gave way to a hard, open plain of wind-packed snow and ice. It looked deceptively smooth, but each step told a different story. Pockets of soft snow lurking beneath a thin crust, sudden cracks that splintered underfoot, brittle ice sheeting over hollows. I moved with a rhythm now, a cautious cadence, the sled a constant weight at my back. A few hours in, I crossed a stretch of snow as flat as a frozen lake. The wind scoured it down to glassy ice, etched with faint lines like veins in marble. The sound of my boots shifted, a hollow, muted thud, and instinct made me halt. I crouched low, brushing the surface with a gloved hand. Spiderweb cracks radiated beneath a thin skin of frost. I adjusted course immediately, giving the area a wide berth. Out here, a single misstep could mean vanishing beneath a paper-thin crust into a hidden crevasse or an ice cave sealed by centuries. The ice wasn't just a barrier. It was alive in its own slow, grinding way. I pressed on. By midday, the sky lightened slightly, a soft opalescent hue casting a sheen over the snow. I paused only briefly to take readings. Surface temperature, barometric pressure, wind speed. The data painted a portrait of a world shifting beneath its frozen skin. Warmer currents whispered through the ground. The air, though biting, held a subtle softness it shouldn't have at this latitude. I recorded everything, my breath slow and steady against the numbing chill. Not long after, I spotted the first sign of melt. A small pool of open water, rimmed with a fragile lace of ice. It was no wider than my boot, but it shouldn't have been there at all. I knelt beside it, watching tiny bubbles rise from beneath the frozen ground. Methane, likely, an ancient gas long trapped in permafrost now freed by warming Earth. I marked the coordinates, snapping a quick photo before moving on. The Arctic wasn't static, it was breathing. The afternoon brought a slow rise in wind. The sky darkened slightly, cloud cover thickening in rolling sheets. I pulled my face covering tighter, adjusted the hood of my parka, and pressed forward. The wind here wasn't just cold, it was a presence of its own, a low constant hum that seeped into your bones. With every step, I felt the weight of the land pressing back. The sled dragged harder against me as snow drifted in soft, ankle-deep piles. I passed ice formations sculpted by the wind, twisted spires of snow and ice rising like frozen phantoms. The colors here felt muted, drained by the vastness. Grays, whites, pale blues. Even the shadows seemed bleached by the endless sky. A world stripped to its rawest form. I crested a low rise in the late afternoon and felt my breath catch. A frozen lake spread before me, its surface stretched taut beneath a thin film of snow. Cracks laced across it in delicate patterns, fractal lines twisting into starbursts and spirals. The lake's far edge vanished into a curtain of soft mist, ice fog rising where the temperature difference met unseen currents below. The sight felt surreal, almost unreal in its silent, static beauty. I stood for a long moment, letting the scene settle into memory. Crossing it would be a risk. I traced a route along the lake's edge, keeping to the thicker ice near the shoreline. The sled's runners whispered softly over the snow. Each step demanded care, testing the ground with poles, watching for the faint tremor of shifting ice. A thin mist clung to the air, curling low around my boots like a living thing. The Arctic revealed itself in small, quiet moments, never in grandeur. The awe came in the details. A faint sound broke the hush, like a soft crack from deep below. I froze. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. The wind paused, the mist still. Nothing. No shift beneath my feet, no further sound. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to move on, pulse a slow hammer against the cold inside my chest. You couldn't afford fear out here. Only caution. Only respect. I pushed on, skirting the lake's edge until the ice fog lifted and the snowfields resumed. Evening crept up slowly, the sun a low smudge behind layered clouds. I felt the onset of fatigue, muscles tight, breath sharp in the cold air. I searched for a suitable camp and found it on a rocky outcrop jutting from the snow. The rocks would serve as a windbreak. I set the tent swiftly, securing lines with ice screws driven deep into packed snow. The routine felt mechanical now. Tent, stove, quick check of gear. Only then did I let myself relax, crouching beside the stove as water hissed into steam. The Arctic twilight bled into night. The temperature plummeted as darkness pressed in. I huddled beside the tent, sipping hot broth from a metal cup, watching the aurora flicker faintly across the sky. Curtains of green shimmered against a canvas of indigo, shifting in silent waves. No sound accompanied them. No grand chorus, no whispered hum, just light in motion. I scribbled notes by headlamp, recording the day's journey. Distance, 14 kilometers. Temperature, -31 degrees Celsius average. Signs of melt and permafrost weakening. Lake crossing noted, risk moderate. I marked a final line in the journal before snapping it shut. The ink smudged slightly in the cold. The hum I'd felt earlier in the frost returned faintly, a low, rhythmic pulse beneath the ground, so subtle I almost thought I imagined it. I pressed a gloved hand to the ice. Nothing, only the silent, endless white. I crawled into the tent and zipped it shut against the night. Tomorrow, I would leave the edge of the mapped region entirely. Tomorrow, I would step beyond the last known traces of human passage. I woke before the faint light of morning could touch the ice. The interior of the tent glowed faintly in the deep pre-dawn, lit only by the muted gleam of frost lining the fabric seams. My breath hung in slow clouds. For a moment, I lay still, listening. The Arctic has a sound, less a noise than a presence, a soft, ever-present hush, like wind trapped inside the bones of the earth. It pressed against the thin shell of my tent, a silent reminder that I was alone beyond the reach of any known trail. I packed quickly, breaking camp and practiced silence. My hands worked with careful efficiency, every motion deliberate. Out here, wasted movement cost energy I couldn't afford to spare. By the time the first silver smudge of dawn bled across the horizon, I was already strapping the sled harness across my chest. Today marked a threshold. The last coordinates marked on any map ended 20 kilometers south of my current position. Satellite data thinned here, fragmented into broad swaths of guesswork. What lay ahead was an expanse of ice and land untouched by human passage, at least in any recorded sense. There were no paths, no cairns, no silent markers of human hands. Just the raw, unwitnessed Arctic. I stepped forward. The terrain shifted almost immediately. Gone were the gentle snowfields and wind-hewn ridges. The land broke into rough ice hummocks, blocks of frozen earth shoved upward by the slow grinding pressure of permafrost and ancient glacial movements. They jutted at sharp angles, rising in uneven patterns like the spine of some buried leviathan. Climbing over them was slow work. The sled caught often, its runners snagging against fractured ice and sharp-edged ridges. I heaved it forward with bursts of effort, heart hammering in tight, measured bursts. The cold stole breath from my lungs even as sweat prickled beneath layers of wool and synthetic fiber. The ice felt different underfoot, less stable, more hollow. Sometimes a step sent a faint crack running outward in a web beneath my boots. Other times, the ground gave slightly, a subtle sag like stepping onto frozen skin stretched too thin. I learned quickly to trust instinct. By midday, the wind shifted. It didn't howl. It didn't rise in some sudden dramatic gust. It simply changed. Subtle at first, a thin undercurrent threading through the air. It carried a different weight, a strange, sharp edge beneath the cold. I pulled up the scarf around my face, adjusted my goggles, and pressed forward, though I could feel something primal tightening in my gut. Snow began to drift in soft, swirling sheets, fine, dry crystals sweeping low across the ice in endless waves. I'd seen ground blizzards before, phantom storms that never reached the sky, but this felt heavier. The wind sang a low, steady note across the ice ridges, vibrating against the sled's aluminum frame. I angled my course eastward, aiming for a cluster of low hills marked faintly on my topomap, a place I could shelter if the storm built strength. Hours passed. The world faded into soft, moving white. Visibility narrowed to meters. The wind-driven snow crept over my boots, clung to the sled's frame, built in tiny, spiraling mounds along the ice. I moved by compass alone, glancing at the dial every few steps, marking my bearings like a mantra. East. East by northeast. Keep moving. I counted steps beneath my breath, a steady rhythm to keep fear from worming in. Somewhere in that white blur, I lost time. The snow thinned suddenly, a brief lull. I emerged from the veil of drifting ice to find myself on the edge of a frozen ravine, its walls sharp with wind-sheared ice, dropping away into a gash of shadow. The ravine split the land like an old scar, 20 meters wide, vanishing into mist both ahead and behind. I stood at its edge, staring into the cold, breath rasping against my mask. The wind sang louder here, a low, mournful sound as it threaded through ice formations lining the ravine walls. I crouched low, studying the surface. The edges looked unstable, cornices of wind-packed snow overhanging thin air. Crossing would be a gamble. I circled southward, seeking a narrowing or a natural bridge. I found neither. The ravine stretched on, silent and patient. Finally, I lowered the sled's anchor and walked to the edge alone, testing each step. The ice shivered faintly beneath my weight, alive with hidden tension. I spotted a section where wind-driven snow had formed a rough shelf across the gap, a snow bridge, brittle and cracked. I tested it with my pole. It held. A choice. I took a breath, tightened every strap on my harness, and edged onto the snow bridge. The ice flexed, soft, almost imperceptible. Each step was measured, each foot placed with the care of a man walking a razor's edge. Beneath me, the darkness of the ravine yawned wide. I moved in silence, boots whispering over snow packed by wind and time. The bridge held, and then gave a soft hairline crack beneath my last step. I launched forward, heart slamming into my ribs as I dove for the opposite ledge. My hands hit ice, scrambling for purchase. The bridge collapsed behind me in a soft, muffled sigh, vanishing into the depths below. I hauled myself over the edge, breath tearing from my throat. Alive. The land beyond the ravine flattened again into rolling ice fields. I retrieved the sled by looping around, a brutal detour that cost me precious hours of daylight. By the time I pulled the sled up over the ridge on the far side, the faint light had bled into early evening. The storm thinned but never quite left, drifting in low waves across the open fields. I pitched camp beneath a jut of ice-stained rock, less shelter than a psychological anchor. The stove hissed softly as I boiled water, hands trembling faintly now that adrenaline drained from my limbs. The wind whispered low over the ice, and I watched as the aurora stirred faintly again on the edge of the sky, soft, pulsing bands of green and violet threading through the dark. I noted the day's events by lantern light, hand moving steadily despite the bone-deep ache. Distance 12 kilometers, crossed unknown ravine, coordinates marked. Storm onset, visibility near zero for 4 hours. Instinct verified, ice bridge collapse avoided. I shut the journal, sealing the pages between insulated covers. Out here, survival wasn't just skill. It was instinct, judgment, the weight of every choice pressed against the ice. I stared into the dark a long time before crawling into the tent. Tomorrow I would press deeper. Tomorrow, the ice would decide if I belonged. I woke to a stillness so profound it felt sacred. The soft crackle of frost beneath the tent walls was the only sound, a gentle whisper against the silence of the open ice. The stove simmered faintly as I brewed a small pot of tea, the warmth seeping into my hands as I cupped it close. The morning air outside was sharp but calm, a crystalline hush hanging over the landscape. I stood at the edge of camp, watching pale ribbons of aurora linger low in the sky, refusing to surrender entirely to dawn. The world around me was vast, untouched, and achingly beautiful. I moved steadily across the open flats, a patchwork of snow-blanketed ice and hard-packed earth beneath my boots. The sled followed without complaint, its runners singing a faint note against the frozen crust. The morning light revealed a landscape sculpted by slow, unseen hands, gentle rises swirled with wind-carved patterns, ice ridges softened by years of snow and sun. At mid-morning, I crested a gentle slope and paused. Before me stretched a frozen lake so still it mirrored the sky with perfect clarity. Thin sheets of ice lay atop one another like layers of glass, each holding faint hints of color. Silvers, blues, translucent greens that caught the light like veins of precious stone. I moved to the shoreline, kneeling where the ice met the land. Beneath the surface, air bubbles lay trapped in perfect spheres, suspended in time. Some clustered in frozen spirals that traced delicate pathways through the ice. I touched the surface with a gloved hand, feeling the cold seep through the layers of fabric. The lake felt alive in its own silent way, a vast frozen lung beneath the ice, waiting for the thaw that would release its hidden breath back into the world. I set up my equipment slowly, taking core samples near the shoreline. The readings confirmed what the patterns hinted at. This lake was ancient, fed by glacial melt and resting upon a bed of permafrost. The methane trapped beneath was centuries old, a silent testimony to the cycles that had shaped this land long before I arrived. By midday, I moved along the lakeshore, circling toward a rise on the far side. The ice beneath my boots was thick and unmoving, a clear invitation to explore. I walked out a short distance, listening to the faint, sonorous hum that occasionally echoed through the ice. A soft groan, low and musical, like a distant cello vibrating just beyond hearing. The Arctic breathes. I wrote in my journal, "You only need to listen." I left the lake behind by early afternoon, pressing further north where the land rippled in long rolling swells of snow and ice. The terrain shifted again, flattening into wide-open plains broken by occasional ice hummocks. These natural formations rose like silent sentinels, wind-sculpted into delicate arches and sharp crests. I passed close to one that towered 3 meters high, its edges so thin they caught the light and fractured it into soft rainbows. I stood beneath its frozen archway for a long time, marveling at the balance between fragility and permanence. These ice structures could stand for decades or collapse in a single gust. The Arctic demanded patience and respect in equal measure. As I moved on, a soft shadow crossed my path. I turned slowly, scanning the open horizon. Far in the distance, a shape, pale against the snow, barely moving. I lowered my goggles slightly, adjusting my focus. The creature stood alone atop a gentle rise, a white Arctic fox, watching with still, unblinking curiosity. Its coat shimmered faintly in the diffuse light, blending seamlessly into the world around it. For a long moment, we regarded one another across the open ice. The fox tilted its head slightly, ears flicking at a sound I couldn't hear. Then, with a quiet grace, it turned and trotted along the ridge before vanishing into the folds of the land. No threat, no fear. Just a quiet acknowledgement, a shared moment between two travelers in a vast and different world. I continued on, my heart lighter. By late afternoon, I approached a shallow valley dotted with pressure ridges, long lines of broken ice where the ground beneath had shifted minutely over the years. The ridges twisted across the plain like frozen waves, their surfaces layered in soft snow. I traced a careful path through them, listening to the wind weave its soft song between the cracks. Here and there, small ice caverns yawned open, natural hollows beneath the ridges, some barely large enough to crawl through, others wide enough to stand inside. I ventured into one near the valley's heart, ducking beneath a low arch of layered frost. Inside, the air was deathly still, the sound of my breath loud against the hush. The walls shimmered faintly, layered with delicate crystals that caught the light in fine spectral hues. I set my lantern down and stood for a moment in the silent chamber, absorbing the weight of untouched time. The cave felt like a cathedral, nature's slow, patient craftsmanship on display in every line of frozen water. I left without disturbing a single crystal. As evening approached, I reached a rise overlooking the valley. I made camp there, anchoring the sled against a natural outcrop of stone. The tent stood firm, the stove's gentle warmth a quiet comfort as I prepared a small meal. I sat outside as the first stars began to prick the darkening sky, watching the land settle into twilight. The Arctic stretched away in all directions, vast, silent, infinite. The aurora stirred again, faint at first, a soft green ripple that slowly grew into wide, sweeping curtains of light. They danced in slow, mesmerizing waves, shifting between hues of green, violet, and soft blue. I watched in quiet wonder, the sky alive with silent movement. No grand revelation, no sudden danger. Just the simple, breathtaking beauty of a world that existed entirely on its own terms. In my journal, I wrote, "The Arctic is not a place to conquer. It is a place to witness." I closed the notebook and leaned back, letting the night's quiet settle into my bones. Tomorrow, I would follow the valley northward. Tomorrow, I would go deeper into the heart of this silent, breathing world. The first pale hints of dawn spilled across the valley as I broke camp. The wind lay dormant. The land stretched in a perfect hush beneath a sky brushed with soft pinks and washed-out blues. I moved north, tracing the natural curve of the valley floor, where ice ridges softened and opened into a broad channel flanked by low, rounded hills. The sled glided easily over the packed snow, its weight a quiet presence behind me. Each step pressed me deeper into a landscape that felt both timeless and constantly shifting. As the sun lifted, more a diffused glow than a distinct orb, the land revealed faint layers of detail. Beneath the snow, long-forgotten riverbeds marked their faint indentations across the plains. The patterns resembled veins in marble, winding lines that hinted at a time when water moved freely across this frozen world. I paused to trace one with a gloved hand, following its gentle arc until it disappeared beneath a ridge of wind-packed ice. I imagined ancient glacial melt carving its way through soft tundra, long before this place settled into its present stillness. By mid-morning, the land offered a quiet surprise. A grove of ice pillars stood ahead, tall, slender formations rising in irregular clusters, each shaped by wind, sun, and slow cycles of freeze and thaw. Some leaned slightly, frozen mid-collapse, while others stood straight and impossibly narrow, tapering to fine points that seemed to pierce the low sky. They reminded me of trees in a petrified forest, ancient guardians standing watch over a land devoid of footprints. I walked among them slowly, boots crunching faintly on hard-packed snow. The ice pillars were alive with delicate patterns, layers of frost feathering along their surfaces, each ridge marking a different season's passing. Sunlight caught on the edges, throwing soft rainbows across the white. I reached out to touch one, fingertips grazing a surface as smooth as polished glass. The Arctic leaves its monuments not in stone, but in silence and ice. I moved on reluctantly, feeling like I was walking out of a cathedral. By midday, the valley narrowed again into a shallow gorge. The wind returned here, a soft, steady breeze flowing gently along the gorge's length. It wasn't harsh or biting, just a constant, quiet breath that moved low across the snow. The sound it made, part whisper, part hum, followed me as I worked my way along the natural corridor. I found another of the Arctic's quiet wonders in the heart of that gorge. A thin ribbon of open water cut through the ice, a melt stream no wider than my boot. Its surface shimmered faintly beneath a skim of clear ice, water moving sluggishly beneath. I knelt beside it, listening to the soft gurgle that barely rose above the whisper of the wind. The water carried small flakes of ice, drifting slowly past like silent travelers on a glassy road. It shouldn't have been there. Not in this season. Not this far north. I recorded the coordinates, took photographs, and dipped a sensor probe into the water. The readings matched those I'd seen earlier, evidence of a changing land, of a system shifting in subtle, inexorable ways. Yet standing there, watching that quiet ribbon of water wind its way beneath the ice, I felt no dread. Only awe. The Arctic was breathing, and I was here to witness it. The afternoon passed in quiet labor. The gorge opened again into a wide basin, rimmed by rolling hills blanketed in soft drifts of wind-scoured snow. I crossed the open plain, stopping only to note occasional changes in the terrain, minor frost heaves, patches of exposed permafrost, subtle shifts in wind patterns. The sled moved easily across the flat ground, and I fell into a quiet rhythm of motion, my breath steady against the thin air. It was here, in the heart of that open basin, that I encountered another traveler. Far ahead, barely a speck against the snow, a figure moved. At first, I thought it a shadow, a trick of light and shifting snow. But as I drew closer, its shape sharpened. It was a caribou, a solitary bull with thick antlers rising like a crown against the sky. Its coat shimmered in shades of white and pale gray, blending almost perfectly with the land. It stood motionless as I approached, head high, eyes fixed on me. I slowed my steps, letting the sled trail gently to a stop. We watched one another across the frozen distance, neither of us making a sound. The wind tugged softly at the edges of my parka. The caribou blinked once, slow and deliberate, then lowered its head to paw gently at the snow. There was no fear, no flight, only a quiet, mutual regard between two beings sharing the same silent world. After a time, the caribou turned slowly and moved on, steady, unhurried, until it vanished into the white. I stood watching until the last flicker of its movement blended seamlessly with the land. Then I resumed my journey, heart steady, feeling less alone in the vastness. Evening approached slowly, the sky shifting into hues of soft amber and deep indigo. The wind softened again, its constant hush fading into a gentle stillness. I found a rise at the basin's northern edge, a small ridge of exposed rock, half buried in wind-carved snow. It offered a perfect perch above the plains, place to rest and observe. I pitched my tent facing the open basin, the sled secured beside it. The stove's quiet warmth filled the shelter as I prepared a simple meal. I sat outside long after the tea cooled in my cup, watching as the stars emerged one by one across the Arctic sky. The aurora began faint tonight, soft green arcs dancing low along the horizon. They shifted slowly, weaving delicate threads across the canvas of night, painting the heavens in silent, flowing color. I watched until my breath came slow and even, a quiet peace, settling deep in my chest. In my journal, beneath the day's notes, I wrote, "The Arctic speaks in whispers. You hear them best when you stop trying to listen. Tomorrow, I would follow the basin's edge toward the great ice fields beyond. Tomorrow, the silence would walk with me again." Morning unfolded like a quiet exhale. The sky softened from black to deep violet before opening into a pale canvas streaked with thin bands of rose and gold. I stepped from the tent into air so still it felt untouched by sound. The snow underfoot gave only the faintest of sighs as I moved, its surface hardened by the night's cold. Overhead, the last flickers of aurora faded into the growing dawn, like embers surrendering to the first rays of light. I broke camp methodically, the routine comforting in its simplicity: roll the sleeping bag, fold the tent, pack the sled. Each action carved its rhythm into the morning silence. I took a moment before leaving to stand at the edge of the ridge, watching the basin below wrapped in thin veils of mist. The Arctic morning is not a thing that announces itself loudly. It arrives with soft hands and a hush, as if the world itself is holding its breath. By the time I descended into the basin, the mist had begun to lift. The air carried a faint sharpness, clean and crisp, edged with the scent of frost. The sled moved smoothly behind me, its runners whispering across the frozen surface. The land here flattened into a broad expanse of wind-packed snow, broken only by the gentle undulations of buried ice ridges. The openness pressed out in every direction, a canvas stretched taut beneath the vast ceiling of sky. As I moved northward, the wind rose gently, brushing faint patterns across the snow. The sun remained low on the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched and shifted as I walked. Each step became part of a slow, steady rhythm: boot, breath, sled, sky. I measured distance by the change in the snow's texture, by the subtle shifts in the sound of my steps. Out here, even the smallest variations became landmarks in a world defined by its sameness. Mid-morning brought a subtle shift in the land. The snow grew thinner, wind scoured in places to reveal the ice beneath, a translucent blue so vivid it seemed to glow from within. Beneath my boots, the ice hummed faintly, a low, continuous tone that resonated just at the edge of hearing. I stopped to listen, crouching low to place a hand against its surface. The sound was real, a vibration traveling through the frozen ground, carried by the ancient pressures locked within the ice itself. Not a warning, not a danger, just the quiet voice of the land in motion, slow and patient, beyond human comprehension. I recorded a brief note in my journal. The ice remembers everything. As the morning deepened, I crested a low rise and found myself standing on the edge of a vast ice field, an expanse so wide it seemed to merge with the sky at the far horizon. The surface shimmered beneath a thin veil of snow, broken only by the faintest ripple of pressure ridges that rose and fell like frozen waves. The scale of it stole my breath, not in fear, but in wonder. This was the heart of the Arctic, raw and immense. I stood for a long time, letting the sight settle into me. The ice reflected the sky in soft gradients, pale blue shifting to silver, touched with hints of lavender. The clouds overhead moved in slow, ponderous drifts, casting faint shadows that glided silently across the frozen plain. There was no sound but the soft whisper of wind and the distant, constant song of the ice beneath my feet. I began crossing the field with slow, deliberate steps. The sled followed smoothly, gliding over the surface with little resistance. The sheer openness brought a quiet clarity to every movement, each step a careful choice, each shift of weight measured. There was no shelter here, no place for error. But there was peace, a deep, resonant calm that filled the air like an unspoken blessing. By midday, the sun hung directly above, its light diffused through high, thin clouds. The world felt suspended in a state of perfect stillness. I paused for a simple meal, a ration bar and melted snow, kneeling on the ice with the sled at my side. The wind moved gently across the field, a soft, ceaseless presence that whispered against my parka and stirred tiny drifts at the edge of my boots. As I sat there, I noticed faint tracks crossing the ice some distance ahead, delicate, precise, spaced in a slow, meandering line. I packed quickly and moved to investigate. The tracks were unmistakably those of a polar hare, its broad, flat feet leaving distinctive imprints in the soft crust of snow. I followed them for a time, tracing their silent path across the ice field. The hare itself remained unseen, a quiet ghost moving just beyond my reach. But the tracks told their own story, of movement, of life, of survival in a world that gave nothing easily. I felt no urge to pursue, no need to find its source. The tracks were enough. Proof that I was not entirely alone in this vast white world. The afternoon brought a slow transformation of the ice field. The pressure ridges grew taller, rising in long, gentle arcs that formed natural corridors through the open expanse. I walked among them, moving in silence beneath arches of sculpted ice that caught the sunlight and fractured it into soft, spectral hues. The wind whispered through the narrow channels, carrying faint echoes that sounded almost like distant voices. I stopped beneath one particularly tall ridge, its surface layered in fine bands of frost and clear ice. The patterns formed delicate whorls, spiraling shapes that traced the slow, ancient movements of the glacier beneath. I rested a hand against the cold surface, feeling the faint hum of the ice beneath my fingers. This was no mere landscape. This was a living history written in frost and time. As the light began to fade into evening, the sky shifted again, softening into shades of deepening blue, touched with streaks of violet and rose. I found a narrow hollow at the base of a large ice ridge, a natural alcove that offered slight shelter from the wind. I set up camp there, the sled anchored beside the tent, the stove lit with practiced ease. I sat outside long after the meal was finished, watching as the first stars blinked into existence overhead. The aurora began faint once more, soft arcs of green and pale violet moving slowly across the darkening sky. They danced in silence, weaving patterns that felt both ancient and new. A quiet symphony played in colors instead of sound. I took a long breath, letting the air fill my lungs, cold and sharp and clean. In my journal, I wrote, "Out here, the sky and the ice speak the same language." I closed the notebook gently, tucking it into the sled before retreating into the warmth of the tent. Tomorrow, I would leave the ice field behind and follow the ridges north, deeper into the places where even the maps held their breath. Tomorrow, I would listen again for the whispers carried on the wind. The morning unfolded beneath a sky washed clean of clouds. I stepped from the tent into a world so still it seemed frozen, not just in temperature, but in time itself. The wind had fallen away entirely, leaving behind a silence so deep it pressed softly against my ears. The snow, undisturbed and gleaming beneath the low arc of the sun, stretched into seamless distance. The great ice field lay quiet behind me now, its memory lingering like a faint echo beneath my boots. I began north again, tracing the line of pressure ridges as they curved gently across the land. The ridges formed a kind of natural boundary, low walls of uplifted ice rising and falling in slow, sinuous arcs. I moved alongside them, watching how the light fractured along their surfaces, rainbows trapped within the veins of translucent blue. The sled followed with a soft hiss, its runners gliding smoothly over the crusted snow. The cold was sharp but clean. Not the biting, skin-scouring cold of a blizzard, nor the dull ache of damp frost. This was a clarity that felt almost medicinal, a pure, bracing force that sharpened every sense. The breath in my lungs tasted of ice and sunlight. My heartbeat moved in slow, steady rhythm against the vast hush of the world. By mid-morning, I reached a place where the ridges broke apart into scattered clusters of ice towers, isolated spires rising from the snow like the petrified bones of some ancient leviathan. I wove my path among them, stepping softly over the thin crust where the wind had swept the snow clear. The towers gleamed in the sunlight, some so slender they seemed impossibly fragile, others broad and solid, layered in smooth sheets of ice pressed into slow, deliberate shapes. I stopped beside one, an elegant column curved slightly to one side, its surface glassy and rippled like frozen water caught mid-flow. I placed a hand against it gently, feeling the subtle texture beneath my glove. It was cold, of course, but not dead. The ice held a quiet resonance, a kind of dormant energy that vibrated faintly beneath its stillness, a silent song that only the land itself could hear. Around me, the Arctic remained silent, but not empty. Everywhere I looked, the land spoke in its own language, patterns in snow, fractures in ice, the soft breath of wind whispering across the frozen ground. Even the sky joined the conversation, its pale expanse shifting subtly with each passing hour, clouds drifting like silent witnesses to a world unchanged by human hands. I paused for a long time beneath those towers, allowing their silent presence to settle into me. There was no urgency here, no need for haste. The Arctic moved at its own pace, a slow, patient rhythm that cared nothing for the clockwork of human time. I recorded a brief line in my journal: "The Arctic does not wait, it simply is." By midday, I left the towers behind and followed the faint incline of a broad, shallow valley that stretched northward. The valley floor was covered in hard-packed snow, traced with fine wind lines that curved and swirled like calligraphy. I walked in silence, each footfall a soft imprint against the frozen surface. The sled moved easily behind, a faithful shadow trailing my every step. The sun remained low, casting long, slender shadows that shifted with me as I moved. The light caught on tiny ice crystals scattered across the snow, making the ground shimmer with quiet brilliance. It was like walking across a field of stars, each one flickering softly beneath my boots. I stopped near the valley's center to take measurements, a routine that had become a kind of ritual. Temperature, wind speed, atmospheric pressure. The instruments hummed faintly, their readouts steady and predictable. I made notes carefully, fingers steady against the cold. It was then I noticed the sound. A low, soft hum, almost a sigh, rising faintly beneath the air's stillness. I turned slowly, scanning the open valley. The sound wasn't threatening nor urgent. It simply was, a presence in the quiet. I listened closely, holding my breath, letting the silence fill every corner of my hearing. It came again, a low, tonal resonance that seemed to rise from the ice itself. I crouched, pressing a hand flat against the snow. The vibration was faint, but real. A subtle, rhythmic pulse that moved through the frozen ground like a heartbeat. Not mechanical, not seismic, just alive. The slow shifting of glacial ice beneath layers of permafrost, moving in rhythms so ancient they made the human concept of time feel trivial. I smiled softly beneath my mask. The Arctic wasn't silent, it was singing. I packed the instruments carefully and resumed my course. The afternoon brought a change in the landscape. A slow rise in elevation that brought me to the lip of a long, narrow plateau. The view from the edge took me by quiet surprise. Below, the land stretched out in soft, rolling waves of snow and ice, broken by scattered formations of wind-carved stone barely visible beneath thin layers of frost. The entire valley caught the afternoon sun at just the right angle, turning the snow into a vast, shimmering sea of gold and silver. I stood motionless, letting the sight fill me. There was no sound but the soft whisper of wind brushing against the hood of my parka. No movement but the slow drift of clouds across the endless sky. I made camp on the edge of the plateau as evening approached. The stove's soft hiss mingled with the faint crackle of ice beneath my boots as I prepared a simple meal. I sat outside long after the last of the sun's light faded, watching the sky bloom into soft violets and deep blues. The aurora came again. A quiet, luminous wave that flowed gently across the sky in long, slow arcs. The colors shifted between soft green and faint violet, weaving patterns so delicate they seemed to move with the breath of the land itself. I watched in silence, feeling the quiet companionship of a world too vast to belong to anyone. I opened my journal beneath the soft glow of the lantern and wrote, "The Arctic sings in colors, whispers in wind, breathes in ice. We do not conquer it. We accompany it." Tomorrow, I would descend into the valley and follow its quiet path northward. Tomorrow, I would listen for the next verse in the song of this silent, breathing world. I woke before the first edge of dawn touched the horizon, the interior of the tent dim with the faintest trace of reflected starlight. The Arctic night had remained calm, its vast silence wrapping around the camp like a soft, unseen blanket. I lay still for a time, listening to the quiet hum of my breath mingling with the gentle crackle of frost against the tent walls. Outside, the world waited in perfect stillness. I broke camp as the eastern sky blushed faintly with the first hints of rose and pale gold. The air was motionless, clear as glass, holding a sharp clarity that seemed to sharpen each sound. The soft crunch of snow beneath my boots, the faint rasp of the sled's bindings as I adjusted them. My breath hung in slow, curling wisps as I worked, the stove's faint hiss the only voice against the vast hush. The plateau greeted me with its familiar silence as I began my descent into the valley. The slope was gentle, the snow packed firm beneath a thin crust of ice. I moved steadily, boots finding sure purchase with each step, the sled following obediently. The cold wrapped around me, sharp and clean, but no longer a thing to fight against. It felt instead like a quiet companion, pressing close in silent understanding. As I reached the valley floor, the land opened once again into soft, rolling expanses of snow broken by gentle rises and shallow basins. The sky overhead remained a soft gradient of pale blue and silver, the sun's light slow to gather strength. The shadows stretched long and thin across the snow, casting delicate patterns in soft contrast. I moved north, following the natural curves of the land as it guided me between low ridges and across frozen flats. The terrain here bore the soft signatures of wind and time, faint ripples in the snow where past storms had swept across, shallow drifts gathered in graceful arcs around exposed stone. Each feature felt deliberate, shaped by patient hands far older than mine. By mid-morning, I entered a narrow corridor between two gentle rises. The wind funneled softly through the passage, a quiet, steady breath that moved with me as I walked. The air carried the faintest scent of ice and untouched earth, a subtle reminder that this place had known no fire, no footprint, no voice but its own. I stopped near the corridor's center when something caught my eye, a faint shimmer of movement at the edge of my vision. I turned slowly, careful not to disturb the natural stillness around me. Atop a low ridge, partially hidden by a drift of snow, a ptarmigan stood watching. Its feathers, pure white against the frost, rendered it nearly invisible, but for the slight tilt of its head and the soft glint of dark eyes. We regarded each other in quiet companionship. The bird remained still, unafraid, its small frame relaxed beneath the soft pulse of wind. After a time, it turned and stepped lightly across the snow, leaving a delicate trail of tracks behind as it disappeared beyond the ridge. I smiled beneath the scarf drawn across my face. Encounters like these were the Arctic's quiet gift, fleeting moments of shared presence in a world defined by solitude. I pressed onward, my heart light with the simple joy of that silent exchange. The valley widened by midday, opening into a broad plain lined with low ridges on either side. I walked at a steady pace, the sled moving easily across the gently undulating ground. The sky remained clear, the sun casting a soft, golden light that made the snow gleam faintly, each crystal catching the light like a sliver of glass. It was here that I first noticed the strange formations beneath the surface. Patches of the snow were darker, their texture subtly different from the surrounding crust. I crouched low to examine them, brushing away the soft top layer with a gloved hand. Beneath, the ice was shot through with fine cracks, delicate, intricate patterns that traced across the surface like frost on glass. I followed one of the lines with my fingers, noting how it spiraled and looped in symmetrical arcs. Natural fracturing, likely, caused by shifts in the ice below, movements too slow to see but powerful enough to leave their mark. The patterns felt less like damage and more like art, a quiet signature left by the slow breath of the land. I recorded the find in my journal, adding a small sketch beside the notes. The Arctic speaks in lines, not words. I stood for a time, simply watching the wind move across the open plain. The world here felt lighter somehow, less burdened by the weight of ice and shadow. Even the air seemed to hum with a soft vitality, a quiet reminder that life here flowed not in grand gestures, but in the simple, endless persistence of being. By afternoon, I reached the edge of a shallow lake, frozen beneath a skin of clear, glassy ice. The surface stretched smooth and unbroken, save for faint lines where shifting temperatures had pressed cracks into long, elegant arcs. Beneath the ice, I could see dark shapes, stones perhaps, or ancient driftwood frozen in place by time and cold. I walked along the shoreline, the sled's runners making soft, rhythmic sounds against the ice. The wind moved gently across the lake's surface, stirring fine crystals into delicate spirals that danced in the sunlight. I paused to watch them. marveling at how something so small could move with such grace across the vast open face of the Arctic. I found a place where the ice had formed a natural window, clear and smooth as polished glass. I knelt and pressed a hand against it, feeling the faint hum of cold beneath my palm. Beneath the surface, tiny bubbles clung to submerged branches, caught in frozen ascent. The water, dark and still, reflected the sky in perfect clarity. I sat beside the lake for a long time, letting the silence fold around me. This was the heart of the journey. Not the distance covered, nor the measurements taken, but the quiet witnessing of a world that asked for nothing but respect. A place where presence alone was enough. I wrote in my journal, "Here, the ice holds the sky, and we hold only what we are willing to let go." Evening descended softly, the sky shifting through shades of gold, lavender, and deep indigo. I made camp at the lake's edge, the tent set snug against a low rise that offered shelter from the gentle wind. The stove hissed softly in the quiet as I prepared a small meal, the scent of hot broth mingling with the crisp air. The stars emerged slowly, each one sharp against the dark velvet of the sky. The aurora came with them, soft at first, a pale green ripple that stretched and shifted above the horizon. It moved in slow, fluid waves, dancing with a grace that seemed born of the land itself. I watched until my eyes grew heavy, the quiet beauty of the moment settling deep into my bones. In my journal, I wrote, "Some places are not meant to be reached, they are meant to be met." Tomorrow, I would follow the lake's shoreline north, deeper into the heart of this vast, breathing world. Tomorrow, I would walk again in the company of silence. The faint blush of dawn had barely begun when I stirred inside the tent. The stove had gone cold hours before, its last ember a fading memory in the Arctic chill. I lay still beneath the heavy folds of my sleeping bag, listening, not for any sound, but for the quality of the silence outside. It greeted me softly, a presence rather than an absence, wrapping the world in a hush that felt neither empty nor expectant. I rose with slow, deliberate movements. There was no need for haste. The Arctic would wait, though not for me. I packed my gear under the soft veil of pre-dawn light, hands steady, breath a rhythmic cloud against the crisp air. The sled's bindings creaked faintly as I secured the last straps. The lake beside me remained still, its glassy surface dark beneath the lingering shadow of night. By the time I set off, the eastern sky glowed faintly with soft amber. I followed the lake's edge, moving in careful strides. The ice stretched smooth and unbroken to my left, the snow-crusted shoreline a quiet guide beneath my feet. The sled glided easily, the cold granting the runners a silent passage over the hard-packed snow. The world softened into a palette of pale blues and muted golds as the sun lifted slowly over the horizon. The wind remained gentle, a companionable whisper at my back. As I walked, I noticed faint tracks crossing the snow ahead, delicate single-file marks that wove in loose arcs before vanishing over a gentle rise. I followed them briefly, curiosity drawing me forward. The tracks belonged to an Arctic fox. I found its trail weaving between small drifts, its prints fresh and precise, each step light against the thin crust of snow. I never saw the fox itself, though I sensed it nearby, a quiet watcher moving with me across the open land. The Arctic allowed such companions, brief and unseen. Their presence felt more than observed. I let the trail guide me back to the lake's edge and continued north. As the morning wore on, the shoreline shifted, broadening into low, sweeping curves where the snow lay in soft waves over the frozen ground. I crossed occasional patches of exposed ice, their surfaces etched with delicate cracks that traced long, elegant arcs beneath the sun's quiet gaze. Some of the cracks formed patterns so intricate they seemed deliberate, like ancient runes pressed into the ice by a careful, unseen hand. At midday, I stopped near a place where the shoreline met a shallow inlet. The ice there was thinner, the water beneath a dark, slow-moving ribbon barely visible beneath its translucent shell. I knelt beside it, watching the faint glimmer of air bubbles rising slowly from the depths before becoming trapped beneath the ice. I touched the surface lightly with gloved fingers, feeling the cold pass gently through the fabric. In my journal, I wrote, "Even the stillest waters move beneath the ice." I sat there for a time, letting the gentle hum of the land settle around me. The Arctic's beauty was never loud. It arrived in quiet impressions, moments that pressed softly against the heart, before dissolving into the broader silence. I had learned not to chase them, only to notice when they came. The afternoon led me along a gradual ascent, where the shoreline rose into a low bluff overlooking the lake. The view from the top stretched in quiet majesty, a vast expanse of frozen water framed by rolling snowfields and distant ridges. The lake glowed faintly under the soft light, a mirror to the pale blue sky above. I sat at the bluff's edge for a long time, letting the peace of the scene wash over me. A soft wind stirred as I resumed my journey, whispering low against the ice. The sled moved smoothly behind me, its quiet presence a comfort in the vast openness. The path grew gentler as I followed the bluff's curve northward, the land settling into soft undulations that rolled beneath my feet in slow, rhythmic waves. It was in that quiet stretch of afternoon that I witnessed one of the Arctic's most delicate wonders. A faint mist rose from the far end of the lake, curling upward in soft spirals that danced gently against the pale sky. The mist caught the sunlight, refracting into delicate hues of gold and soft pink. I watched as it moved slowly across the ice, weaving in fluid patterns that shimmered faintly before dissolving into the air. There was no storm, no sudden shift of temperature, only the quiet breath of the land releasing its hidden warmth into the sky. I stood motionless, heart steady, watching the soft ballet of mist and light. It lasted no more than a few minutes, vanishing as quietly as it had come. I left no note for it in my journal. Some moments belonged only to memory. By late afternoon, I reached a narrow stretch of land, where the lake narrowed into a frozen channel. The ice here grew thick and opaque, its surface marked by long, smooth ridges, shaped by the slow, relentless press of the shifting water beneath. I crossed carefully, testing each step with deliberate care. The sled followed, its weight moving easily over the hardened crust. The wind softened further, becoming a faint breath that stirred the edge of the channel. The silence remained, a constant presence that filled the world with its soft hum. Evening approached in slow, quiet steps. I set camp on a small rise overlooking the channel's northern edge, the tent anchored firmly against the light breeze. The stove crackled faintly as I prepared a simple meal, the warmth seeping gently into the air around me. I sat outside, watching as the last light of day stretched in soft rays across the snow. The stars emerged slowly, each one sharp and clear against the velvet of the darkening sky. The aurora followed, a soft ribbon of pale green that wove gently through the night, its light flowing in silent, graceful arcs. I watched long after the meal had cooled, letting the quiet beauty of the night settle deep within me. In my journal, I wrote, "Some journeys are measured not in distance, but in the spaces between heartbeats." Tomorrow, I would leave the lake behind and follow the faint rise of land toward the distant ice fields beyond. Tomorrow, I would walk again into the heart of the silent north. The air felt sharper at dawn, not colder exactly, but edged with a thin, quiet energy, as though the land itself stirred beneath the frost. I stepped out from the tent into a muted gray light. The sky brushed with soft clouds stretched in long, gentle bands. The lake behind me lay in perfect stillness, its surface a silent mirror, fading beneath a veil of low mist. I stood for a moment, the sled harness in hand, listening to the soft hum of the wind curling faintly over the ice. Today marked a threshold. Though maps had guided me this far, what lay ahead remained largely unknown. An expanse of land marked by satellite imagery, only in sweeping shades of white and shadow. The northern ice fields I approached held no trails, no recorded crossings in the last century. A place beyond the reach of recorded steps, touched only by the slow drift of snow and the passing of ancient winds. I packed the sled carefully, securing each strap with quiet precision. The motions felt slower this morning, deliberate, as if my hands understood the quiet weight of the day before my mind fully caught up. I took one last look at the lake's frozen channel before stepping forward, my boots pressing fresh imprints into the thin crust of snow. The land rose gently as I followed the shoreline northward, a long, gradual ascent that lifted me toward a ridge cresting beneath the soft morning light. The sled pulled easily, the snow firm and crisp beneath the runners. The wind moved at my back, a quiet encouragement that stirred the fine edge of my parka. By mid-morning, I reached the top of the ridge. The view unfolded slowly as I crested the rise, a vast, open expanse where the snow stretched flat and unbroken toward the distant horizon. The ice fields began here, their surface a pale, undulating sea that shimmered faintly beneath the soft gaze of the sun. Pressure ridges ran in low, meandering lines across the plain, subtle as brushstrokes against the canvas of white. The sky hung wide and clear above, an endless vault of soft blue threaded with faint wisps of high clouds. The sun hovered low, casting long, slender shadows that drifted gently across the snow. There was no sound but the faint hush of the wind and the soft, steady rhythm of my breath moving in quiet counterpoint. I stood at the edge of that silent sea for a long time, letting the sight settle into me. The final leg of the journey stretched beyond that horizon. This was the farthest I would travel. Beyond this point, I would set camp for my final observations before turning south once more. It felt neither an end nor a beginning, but a quiet juncture in the slow, unfolding passage of this silent land. The Arctic did not mark boundaries as men did. It shifted gently, fluid as the wind, offering itself only to those willing to move at its pace. I made my descent into the edge of the ice field with slow, measured steps. The sled followed silently, its weight a steady presence behind me. The snow grew finer here, wind pressed into delicate patterns that caught the sun in soft, shifting highlights. The land moved beneath me in subtle waves, barely perceptible rises and falls that echoed the slow rhythm of glacial breath. By midday, I came upon a field of frost blooms, tiny crystalline structures rising delicately from the ice, their shapes intricate and impossibly fragile. They shimmered faintly in the light, each one unique, formed by perfect combinations of cold, moisture, and time. I walked among them with care, placing each step with quiet reverence, mindful of the unseen artistry beneath my boots. I paused to examine a cluster that stood close together. Feathers of ice rising in delicate arcs, edges catching the sun in fine, luminous halos. I knelt beside them, feeling the quiet hum of the land press softly against my heart. I wrote in my journal, even the smallest things endure where nothing should. The Arctic's wonder did not lie in its grandeur alone, but in the fine details it offered freely to those patient enough to notice. I continued north. The afternoon light softened as I moved deeper into the ice field, the sun tracing long-stepped, shallow arcs across the open sky. The wind picked up slightly, carrying faint whispers over the frozen. I pulled my hood tighter, adjusting the sled's lines, and pressed forward. The ice beneath my boots hummed faintly with each step, a quiet reminder of the slow, powerful movements hidden beneath the surface. By late afternoon, I came upon a formation that stole my breath in its quiet simplicity, a solitary ice dome, rising smooth and flawless from the surrounding field. Its surface shimmered like glass, faint fractures running in soft, spiraling patterns beneath the surface. It stood perhaps 3 meters high, untouched by wind or drift. I approached with slow steps, standing close enough to see the delicate layering beneath its smooth surface. The dome reflected the sky in soft, warped patterns, clouds shifting gently along its curved face. I pressed a hand lightly against the ice, feeling its cool strength beneath my glove. The dome felt alive in its silent grace, an unspoken monument to the patience of time. I sat beside it for a while, the sled at rest behind me, the wind moving gently past. I watched as the light shifted across its surface, shadows lengthening as the sun slipped quietly toward the horizon. In my journal I wrote, "The Arctic does not keep us, it lets us pass." Evening drew close as I made camp near the ice dome, anchoring the tent in the shadow of its graceful curve. The stove's quiet hum filled the shelter as I prepared my meal, the warmth a soft cocoon against the growing chill. Outside, the sky faded into deep shades of violet and indigo, the first stars emerging sharp and bright against the darkening vault. I sat outside long after the last embers of light faded, watching the aurora bloom gently across the sky. The colors moved in slow, delicate waves, soft green and pale violet drifting in silent arcs. I watched as they danced, their light weaving a quiet song across the vast canvas of night. This was my final night before the turn south. The end of the outward journey, but not of the experience. The Arctic did not offer closure or climax. It unfolded like a story with no final chapter, each page turning softly beneath the quiet gaze of the sky. I closed my journal with care, tucking it gently beneath the folds of my pack. Tomorrow, I would reach the farthest point of my route, the edge of the unmapped ice. Tomorrow, I would stand at the silent threshold of the Arctic's vast, breathing heart. And then, I would begin the long, quiet journey home. I wake now to a different kind of silence. The faint hum of city life filters through the thin walls of my apartment. Distant traffic, the low murmur of footsteps on pavement, the soft mechanical whir of radiators and streetlights. Morning slips in beneath drawn curtains, casting the faintest outline of gray against the ceiling. The air feels warm, still, heavy with the weight of indoor life. I lie still for a long while, letting the quiet press in, listening for something that isn't there. There's no wind brushing softly against tent walls, no low hum of frost shifting beneath my boots, no sound of ice breathing quietly beneath a sky wide enough to swallow everything I've ever known. Just the city's soft pulse, the constant undercurrent of people, motion, the unnoticed hum of a world wrapped too tightly around itself. I sit up slowly, hands running across the familiar lines of blankets and linen sheets. The texture feels alien compared to the rough canvas of a tent floor, the hard press of permafrost beneath thin layers of insulation. The walls around me stand straight and unwavering, unmoving, unyielding, unlike the soft, living curves of wind-shaped snow and ice. A single plant sits on the windowsill, its leaves catching the softest sliver of morning light. The closest thing here to wildness. I rise with deliberate movements, the wooden floor cool beneath bare feet. The city's breath feels thick, closed in. A hush not of reverence, but of routine. Steam rises gently from a mug of tea as I stand by the window, staring out at a street lined with steel and glass. It's strange. I know this place better. I know its rhythms, its sharp edges and soft corners, the predictable dance of noise and light. And yet, I don't know it the way I know the Arctic. Not like I know the way wind moves across an open ice field at dawn, carrying whispers that never reach a city skyline. Not like I know the feeling of standing alone beneath a sky so wide it presses against your heartbeat, silent and immense and alive. Not like I know the song of snow shifting beneath your feet, a soft, endless hum that becomes part of your pulse before you even realize it's there. In the Arctic, I moved with the land, not against it. Here, I move around things, around walls, around people, around noise. I take a slow sip of tea, letting the warmth settle in my chest. The taste is familiar, city water, steeped leaves, filtered air. But my mind drifts to mornings when the first sip came with the hiss of a stove crackling against sub-zero air, when the wind slipped beneath the edge of the tent flap, carrying with it the scent of frost and untouched snow. There was a freedom in the Arctic I can't explain in words. Out there, each moment was simple. Wake, walk, listen, watch. No clocks, no calendars, no artificial boundaries wrapped around the hours. Here, the hours slip past in meetings, phone calls, schedules drawn tight across a canvas of cement and glass. The air feels too still, the sounds too close, the colors too muted beneath the thick gray skin of city life. And yet, I know the Arctic is still there. Still breathing beneath its endless sky, the wind tracing slow paths across ice ridges, the snow settling softly into valleys no foot has touched. The aurora still dances in silent arcs, weaving soft songs across a sky stretched wide with quiet. The ice fields hum beneath layers of ancient frost, alive with a patience the world here will never understand. And though I stand now beneath a ceiling instead of a sky, a part of me still moves with that silent rhythm. I close my eyes for a moment, letting memory rise like slow mist across still water. I see the frost blooms catching the light in soft halos. I hear the wind breathing low between the ice towers. I feel the hum of the frozen ground beneath my boots. It's all still there. And though I've left that world behind, though I walk now on crowded streets and sleep beneath city lights, I know I will go back. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not this season, but the Arctic waits in no rush. It moves at its own pace, patient and vast and alive, and when I return, it will meet me with the same quiet breath, the same soft song, the same endless sky. Until then, I carry its silence with me. I turn from the window, setting the mug gently on the table. The day waits. Meetings, calls, the familiar hum of the city's quiet noise. I step forward, moving into the soft hush of a world too small for wide skies. But somewhere inside, I'm still walking beneath that open sky. Still hearing the soft hum of ice beneath my feet, still waiting for the wind to rise. And I know, Until next time, the Arctic will be waiting.